Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the remote hills of the Ozark Mountains, 12 miles northwest of Lebanon, Missouri, stands a structure that has remained sealed by federal order for over a century. The Greystone Asylum, built in 1867 from massive blocks of local limestone, was designed to house the mentally ill from 5 surrounding counties. According to records preserved in the Missouri State Archives, the facility was constructed in a narrow valley accessible only by a single winding road that climbs through dense oak forests and between towering limestone bluffs. The isolation was intentional. Dr. Cornelius Greystone, the asylum's founder and first superintendent, believed that distance from the chaos of civilization would provide patients with the tranquility necessary for recovery. Architectural surveys from the period describe an imposing 4-story structure with thick stone walls, high windows fitted with iron bars, and a central courtyard designed to provide patients with fresh air and exercise. Dr. Greystone's early writings, preserved in medical school archives, reveal a progressive thinker who advocated for humane treatment at a time when many institutions relied on restraints and isolation. He implemented occupational therapy, encouraged outdoor activity, and limited the use of physical restraints to only the most severe cases. For its first years of operation, the Greystone Asylum enjoyed a reputation as one of the more enlightened facilities in the region. County records document favorable outcomes, with several patients recovering sufficiently to return to their families. Yet for all its promise, the asylum operated for only 36 years before its abrupt closure in 1903. On March 15th of that year, federal marshals arrived at the facility, ordered all remaining occupants removed, and sealed the building with explicit instructions that it was never to be reopened. The order, preserved in federal archives and partially declassified in 1978, contained an unusual clause stating that the prohibition was permanent and non-negotiable, to remain in effect in perpetuity regardless of changes in ownership or jurisdiction. What could have transpired within those limestone walls to warrant such extraordinary federal intervention? What mystery lies at the heart of the Greystone Asylum that more than a century later, federal authorities still refuse to allow the building to be entered or demolished? The answer to that question begins with something that should not exist. According to architectural plans preserved in the Missouri State Archives, the Greystone Asylum followed conventional design principles for institutional buildings of its era. The main structure rose 4 stories above ground level, with patient wards occupying the upper floors, administrative offices and staff quarters on the second level, and common areas, including a dining hall and medical facilities on the ground floor. The basement level, partially below ground, housed storage areas, a laundry facility, and the isolation ward where patients deemed dangerous to themselves or others could be confined for observation and treatment. Yet there was one feature of the basement that appeared in no architectural plans, that served no apparent practical purpose, and that would become the focal point of everything that followed. In the center of the isolation ward, occupying a circular chamber carved directly from the bedrock, stood a stone well of unprecedented dimensions. This was no ordinary well. Construction documents reveal that it measured 22 feet in diameter, far larger than any well needed solely for water collection. The original building plans from 1867, meticulously drawn by architect Samuel Whitmore of Street Lewis, show no well in the basement level. Water for the asylum was to be supplied by a standard well in the courtyard and supplemented by rainwater collection systems. Yet superintendent logs from 1872, preserved in asylum records, discovered during the 1903 federal seizure and partially released decades later, document the addition of what Dr. Down Greystone referred to as the deep well. Financial ledgers from that year show substantial expenditures for specialized drilling equipment and stonework, far exceeding what would be required for a simple water source. Staff correspondence from the period describes the well's unusual characteristics. Head nurse Margaret Ashford, in a letter to her sister dated November 1872, wrote that the new well-produced water that was peculiarly cold, far colder than the courtyard well despite being drawn from the same aquifer. She noted that sounds echoed strangely when spoken near the well's opening, voices seeming to travel down into the depths and return transformed, as if altered by the journey through the stone. Most curious was a notation in the asylum's maintenance log from December 1872, stating that measuring the well's depth had proven impossible. Multiple attempts to sound the bottom using weighted ropes had failed, with the lines running out at over 200 feet without touching bottom or water level. The Greystone Asylum's early years of operation, from its opening in 1867 through 1871, reveal an institution that functioned much like other progressive facilities of the era. Patient intake records preserved in state archives document admissions typical for the period. Veterans of the recent Civil War suffering from what contemporaries called soldier's heart, a condition modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Women diagnosed with hysteria, a catch-all term for various psychological and emotional distresses. Men committed for religious mania, believing themselves possessed by divine or demonic forces. Cases of alcoholic delirium, melancholia, and what was termed moral insanity, encompassing various behavioral disorders. The Lebanon Gazette and Springfield Republican newspapers from these years contain occasional mentions of the asylum, generally favorable in tone, describing Dr. Greystone's innovative approaches to treatment. Unlike many superintendents of the era who relied heavily on restraints, sedation, and isolation, Dr. Greystone emphasized what he called therapeutic occupation. Patients who were physically capable worked in the asylum's gardens, tended livestock, and participated in workshops producing goods for the facility's use. Those unable to perform physical labor engaged in reading, music, and artistic pursuits. Staff payroll records from the Missouri State Archives identify key personnel during this period. Margaret Ashford served as head nurse, overseeing patient care and supervising junior nursing staff. James Wheaton worked as chief orderly, responsible for maintaining order and assisting with patients who became agitated or violent. Dr. Benjamin Ashworth, a young physician who had studied at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, served as Dr. Greystone's assistant and was responsible for day-to-day medical care, while the superintendent focused on administrative duties and research. Personal correspondence, preserved in various family collections, provides glimpses into the asylum's routine operations. Staff members wrote home, describing 12-hour shifts, challenging but not unusually difficult work, and a superintendent who, while demanding, seemed genuinely committed to his patients' welfare. Treatment outcomes during these early years were documented as relatively successful. Release records show that approximately 1 in 4 patients improved sufficiently to return to family care, a rate comparable to other progressive institutions of the period. The well is mentioned only once in documents from these years. In Dr. Greystone's journal from October 1871, where he writes cryptically about a planned addition to improve the facility's therapeutic capabilities. The construction of the deep well in the spring and summer of 1872 marks the point where the Greystone Asylum's documented history begins to diverge from the ordinary. Financial records preserved in asylum ledgers show that in April 1872, Dr. Greystone contracted with a specialized drilling crew from St. Louis, paying rates significantly above standard for such work. The crew consisted of 8 men, led by a German immigrant named Friedrich Brenner, who had experience drilling deep wells in limestone formations. What made this arrangement unusual was documented in several sources. A letter from asylum bookkeeper Harold Winters to the county commissioners, questioning the expenditure, notes that the drilling crew was instructed to work exclusively during nighttime hours. Staff directives from Dr. Greystone, preserved in the asylum's administrative files, ordered all personnel to keep patients away from the basement level during construction, citing safety concerns about drilling operations. Most revealing is the personal diary of Samuel Porter, a local stonemason hired to line the well with cut limestone blocks. Porter's diary, discovered by his great-grandson in 1948 and eventually donated to the Lebanon Historical Society, provides the only detailed account of the well's construction. Porter describes reporting to the asylum each evening after dark and working by lantern light to set massive limestone blocks in a circular pattern, descending deeper into the earth with each night's progress. He notes that the blocks were not quarried locally but had been specially ordered by Dr. Greystone from a source Porter did not recognize. Most disturbing were the markings carved into each block. Porter, a literate man with some education, wrote that these inscriptions were not letters or numbers in any language he knew, but rather geometric patterns and symbols that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, creating an optical effect that made him uneasy. He and 2 other workers reported hearing sounds rising from the depths as they descended deeper, sounds they described as voices or singing, though they could never quite make out words. Porter's final entry regarding the well, dated the 3rd of August 1872, reads that the work was complete, that the well now descended at least 200 feet to reach a natural chamber in the limestone far below, and that Dr. Greystone seemed pleased beyond measure, speaking of therapeutic applications that would revolutionize the treatment of mental disease. An iron grate was installed over the well's opening, secured with a locked door, and access was restricted to Dr. Greystone alone. Beginning in late 1872 and continuing through 1875, the medical records of the Greystone Asylum underwent a subtle but significant transformation. Patient case files, preserved in state archives, examined by researcher Clara Whitmore in her comprehensive 1967 study of the facility, reveal the introduction of a new treatment protocol designated in medical charts only as deep water therapy. The records provide frustratingly few details about the nature of this treatment. Chart notations indicate that certain patients, specifically those diagnosed with severe melancholia or persistent mania, were selected for the therapy and taken to the basement level for sessions lasting between 2 and 4 hours. Dr. Greystone's medical notes describe the treatment as remarkably effective, with violent patients becoming docile and withdrawn patients showing increased engagement with their surroundings. Yet family correspondence from this period, preserved in various county historical archives and private collections, tells a more troubling story. Letters from relatives visiting patients who had undergone the deep water therapy describe profound changes in their loved ones. Martha Hensley, whose husband Jacob had been committed in 1872 for alcoholic delirium, wrote to her sister in December 1873, describing a visit to the asylum. She found Jacob physically well but mentally transformed. He no longer recognized her face or recalled their children's names. His eyes, she wrote, seemed hollow and distant, as if he were looking at something very far away that others could not see. Most disturbing, Jacob repeatedly asked when he could return to the listening chamber, becoming agitated when staff refused his requests. Other letters describe similar changes. Patients who had been agitated and difficult became passive and compliant, but also seemed detached from reality in ways that exceeded their original symptoms. Several family members noted that their relatives seemed to be listening to things others could not hear, tilting their heads as if trying to make out distant sounds. The first disappearance occurred in March 1874. Patient number 127, identified in intake records as Robert Kimball, a 4-year-old farmer committed for religious mania, simply vanished from the asylum census. His chart contains a final notation stating transferred, but unlike every other transfer in the asylum's records, no destination facility is listed, no receiving physician is named, and no family member signed release papers. When Kimball's brother inquired about his whereabouts in June 1874, Dr. Greystone informed him that Robert had been released to the care of a specialist in Chicago, but no name or address was provided. Margaret Ashford had served as head nurse at the Greystone Asylum since its opening in 1867, and her personal journal, discovered among her effects after her death in 1887 and eventually donated to the Missouri Historical Society in 1955, provides the most detailed insider account of the changes that began to overtake the facility. Her entries from 1875 onward paint a picture of growing unease and mounting concern about Dr. Greystone's methods and the patients undergoing deep water therapy. In April 1875, she writes of a patient named Sarah Mitchell who returned from a session in the basement fundamentally altered. Mitchell had been admitted for hysteria following the death of her infant child and had been responding well to conventional treatment. After her first deep-water therapy session, however, she became fixated on the well, spending hours sitting in the corridor outside the basement door, claiming she could hear voices calling to her from below. Ashford's entries document similar changes in other patients. They would return from the basement calm and compliant, but also strangely absent, as if their consciousness had partially departed their bodies. They spoke of the ones who wait below and the voices that understand, phrases that meant nothing to the nursing staff, but seemed significant to the patients themselves. Most troubling to Ashford was Dr. Greystone's behavior. She writes of finding him in the basement at all hours, sometimes spending entire nights there despite his advancing age. He began keeping detailed notes in a private journal that he carried with him constantly, filling page after page with writing that Ashford glimpsed once and described as those same strange markings that adorned the stones of the well, symbols that hurt the eyes to look upon. She attempted to raise her concerns with Dr. Benjamin Ashworth, Greystone's assistant, but he dismissed them as products of overwork and worry. Ashworth maintained that Greystone's methods, while unconventional, were producing remarkable results in managing difficult patients. Yet Ashford persisted in documenting her observations. Her October 1876 entry reveals what may have been the beginning of systematic concealment. She notes that 3 patients she had personally cared for, patients whose names she knew and whose conditions she had tracked, were suddenly absent from the ward census. Official records listed them as released to family care, but Ashford could find no discharge paperwork, no signatures from relatives collecting their family members, no entries in the visitation log showing family members arriving to take patients home. She confronted Dr. Greystone about the discrepancies, and he responded with cold anger, informing her that administrative matters were not her concern and that she should focus on patient care rather than record-keeping. Dr. Benjamin Ashworth, 32 years old and in his 6th year as assistant superintendent at the Greystone Asylum, vanished on the night of the 14th of January, 1877. Staff testimony preserved in county sheriff records, collected during the brief investigation that followed, establishes the basic timeline. Ashworth had spent the preceding week expressing concerns to several staff members about inconsistencies in patient records and Dr. Greystone's increasingly secretive conduct. On January 13th, he informed his wife Catherine that he intended to conduct a thorough inventory of the basement level and examine the area where the deep water therapy was administered. He told her he planned to document his findings and submit a formal request to the State Asylum Board for a comprehensive review of Dr. Greystone's methods. That evening, Ashworth ate dinner with his wife at their cottage on the asylum grounds, then told her he needed to visit the basement to gather final evidence for his report. He took a lantern and his medical bag and walked to the main building. He was never seen again. The next morning, when Ashworth failed to appear for breakfast, Catherine went to the asylum to look for him. She found his medical bag sitting outside the locked door to the basement level, along with his lantern, extinguished but still warm. Dr. Greystone, when informed of Ashworth's disappearance, expressed surprise and concern, but offered no explanation. He told staff that Ashworth had mentioned receiving an offer for a position in Chicago and might have departed without notice, though this contradicted everything Catherine knew about her husband's plans. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood of Laclede County conducted a 3-day investigation, interviewing asylum staff and searching the building and grounds. He found no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, no indication that Ashworth had left the property. Most significant was a note discovered in Ashworth's desk drawer, written in his hand and dated the 13th of January, 1877. It read, "The well doesn't draw water. It draws something else. CG has lost himself in whatever speaks from below. I must see for myself what lies at the bottom." Catherine Ashworth insisted her husband would never have abandoned her without word, but without a body or evidence of violence, Sheriff Blackwood could do nothing. The official report listed Dr. Benjamin Ashworth as missing, presumed to have left the area, though no subsequent trace of him was ever found in census records, medical directories, or any other documentation. His name would be the first of many to vanish from all records following association with the Greystone Asylum and its mysterious deep well. Between 1877 and 1885, the patient population of the Greystone Asylum underwent a dramatic and inexplicable decline. Census records from the Missouri Department of Public Health, examined by historical investigator Clara Whitmore in her comprehensive 1967 study, reveal a disturbing pattern. During this 8-year period, the asylum admitted approximately 80 new patients according to intake logs. However, by 1885, only 43 patients remained in residence. Official transfer documents and release records account for perhaps 20 of the missing individuals, leaving a gap of nearly 40 patients who simply disappeared from all documentation. Whitmore spent months cross-referencing asylum records with county death certificates, family correspondence collected from various historical societies, census data, and church burial records. She documented at least 25 patients who had no death certificate on file despite being seriously mentally ill, individuals unlikely to survive long without institutional care, no record of transfer to any other facility in Missouri or neighboring states, and no subsequent appearance in census records, city directories, or family documents. Most of these missing patients shared certain characteristics. They had no close family, or their families had stopped visiting and corresponding, making them people whose disappearance would raise minimal alarm. Several had been subjected to multiple deep-water therapy sessions, according to medical chart notations. All had been residents during the period when Dr. Greystone was spending increasingly long periods in the basement level. The remaining patients exhibited increasingly disturbing behaviors, documented in medical records with growing frequency. A condition described as well fixation appeared repeatedly in chart notes. Patients would spend hours sitting on the floor above the basement, claiming they could hear voices calling from below. They spoke of the congregation beneath the asylum and the ones who sing in the stone. Some requested to be taken to the basement, becoming agitated when denied. Others expressed terror at the prospect, yet seemed compelled to approach the basement door despite their fear. Dr. Greystone's medical notes from this period, preserved in fragments that survived his attempt to destroy them in 1903, contain increasingly cryptic references to subjects who have achieved integration with the resonant chamber, and patients who now serve a higher therapeutic purpose. Nursing staff reported that certain long-term patients seemed to know things they should not, speaking of events occurring in distant parts of the asylum, or mentioning details about staff members' private lives that had never been discussed in their presence, as if information were somehow traveling through the building's ventilation system, or perhaps through the limestone itself. The institutional knowledge of what was truly happening at the Greystone Asylum began to die along with the staff members who held it. Head nurse Margaret Ashford, who had faithfully served the asylum since its opening and who had become increasingly concerned about Dr. Greystone's methods, died suddenly in March 1887. She was 42 years old, with no history of heart disease, yet Dr. Greystone certified her death as due to sudden heart failure. Her body was discovered in her quarters on the asylum grounds, and she was buried quickly with minimal ceremony. Her personal journal, found among her effects, ends with an entry dated 2 days before her death. The final passage reads, "I have seen what he keeps at the bottom of the well. God forgive me. I looked through the grate while he was conducting his midnight ritual. They are not dead. I wish to God they were dead. What he has done to them, what they have become, is worse than any death. They are alive down there in the dark water, and they are singing. All of them, singing together in voices that are no longer quite human. I confronted him, and he knows I know. I fear I have made a terrible mistake." The journal provides no further details about what Ashford witnessed. James Wheaton, the chief orderly who had been with the asylum since 1869, departed suddenly in August 1888. His exit interview, preserved in employment records, states that he was leaving to accept a position with a hospital in Kansas City, but family correspondence discovered by researcher Clara Whitmore reveals a different story. Wheaton wrote to his brother that he could no longer remain at the asylum after hearing voices calling his name from the ventilation shafts that connected to the basement level. He described lying awake at night in his quarters and hearing his name spoken by multiple voices in unison, rising from the grates in the floor. When he investigated, following the sound to the basement door, he claimed to have heard Dr. Greystone's voice mixed among the others, though Greystone was supposedly in his office on the second floor. 3 other long-term staff members departed between 1,885 and 1,890, each citing personal reasons. Interviews with their families, conducted decades later by various researchers, revealed that all had experienced similar disturbing phenomena. Sounds rising from below, patients who seemed to possess knowledge they should not have, and Dr. Greystone's increasingly erratic behavior, particularly his habit of descending into the basement at night and remaining there until dawn. Staff members who remained were increasingly those with no long-term history at the asylum, employees who had not witnessed the changes over time and who knew only the current state of affairs as normal. In early 1891, the Missouri State Asylum Board received a series of anonymous letters detailing disturbing allegations about conditions at the Greystone Asylum. The letters, preserved in state archives and signed only as a concerned Christian, described patient mistreatment, unauthorized medical experiments, and suspicious disappearances spanning nearly 2 decades. The allegations were serious enough that the board dispatched Inspector Harold Morrison from Jefferson City to conduct a formal review. Morrison's official report, filed in March 1891, provides a window into the asylum as it appeared to outside eyes. He spent 2 weeks at the facility, during which he interviewed staff, examined patients, and reviewed available records. His report notes that the physical plant was well maintained despite its age, that patients appeared adequately fed and housed, and that no evidence of deliberate mistreatment was observed. However, Morrison documented several concerning findings. Multiple patients exhibited what he termed unusual psychological fixations regarding the building's basement level. When questioned, they spoke in vague terms about voices from below and seemed reluctant to discuss the matter in detail, as if fearful of being overheard. Morrison requested access to complete patient records spanning the asylum's operational history, but Dr. Greystone informed him that regrettable lapses in record-keeping by previous administrative staff had resulted in gaps in documentation. Multiple ledgers had been damaged by moisture, Greystone explained, and some records had been accidentally destroyed in a small fire in the records room in 1885. Most significantly, when Morrison requested access to the basement level to inspect the isolation ward and observe the deep water therapy that appeared in multiple medical charts, Dr. Greystone refused. He claimed the basement was undergoing structural repairs and was unsafe for visitors, though Morrison noted that he observed no construction equipment or workers during his entire visit. Morrison's report recommended a follow-up inspection with mandatory access to all areas of the facility. However, before this could be arranged, Inspector Harold Morrison died in a train accident while returning to Jefferson City, killed when his passenger car derailed on a curve outside of Rolla. His personal notebook, discovered among his effects after the accident and preserved with his official papers, contained observations not included in his formal report. One entry reads, "Dr. Greystone has the eyes of a man who has not slept properly in years. The patients speak in whispers of those below and the ones in the water. Something is profoundly wrong in this place, but without access to the basement and complete records, I cannot determine precisely what. I will recommend a more aggressive follow-up investigation with authority to compel cooperation." During the asylum's final decade of operation, from 1891 to 1902, the Greystone facility gradually withdrew from all engagement with the surrounding community. Dr. Greystone, now in his 70s, but still maintaining iron control over the institution, ceased accepting new patient admissions in 1895. His explanation to county officials, preserved in correspondence at the county courthouse, cited capacity limitations and the need to focus resources on long-term residents requiring intensive care. The patient population dwindled steadily. By 1900, fewer than 20 individuals remained in residence, all of them long-term patients with no living family members or whose families had long since ceased contact. Staff turnover became extreme. Employment records show that most workers lasted only a few months before requesting transfer to other positions or simply abandoning their posts. Those who remained were typically individuals with limited employment prospects elsewhere, people who needed the work desperately enough to overlook the asylum's increasingly strange atmosphere. Local residents began reporting unusual phenomena centered on the asylum property. Multiple accounts, preserved in newspaper archives, personal diaries, and oral histories, collected by later researchers, described lights visible in the asylum's windows at odd hours, particularly in the basement level where no windows should have been accessible. Sounds carried on the wind from the direction of the facility, described variously as singing, chanting, or voices speaking in unison but in no recognizable language. Livestock became agitated when herded along roads passing near the asylum, refusing to go forward and often breaking away in panic. Farmers began avoiding that route, choosing longer alternate paths despite the inconvenience. The most detailed contemporary account comes from Daniel Kershaw, whose family farm bordered the asylum property to the west. In testimony given to Sheriff Henderson in 1903 and preserved in county records, Kershaw described an incident from October 1899. He had been awakened late at night by sounds of screaming coming from the direction of the asylum. Concerned that patients might be in distress or that a fire had broken out, Kershaw rode to the facility to offer assistance. What he witnessed, he stated, would haunt him for the remainder of his life. He approached from the rear of the building and saw lights in the basement windows, which he noted were below ground level and should not have been visible from outside. Through these windows, he observed figures moving, far more figures than the small number of patients supposed to be in residence. Most disturbing, he claimed to see Dr. Greystone descending into the well on some kind of rope ladder, and patients lined up along the edge of the well's opening, as if waiting their turn to follow him into the depths. The events of the 7th of March 1903 marked the end of the Greystone Asylum's operational history and the beginning of its permanent sealing. Multiple sources document what transpired that night. Sheriff William Henderson's official report, federal marshal records declassified in 1978, and testimony from Dr. Ernest Fletcher, a physician from Lebanon, provide a consistent, if incomplete, account. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, residents of the valley noticed flames visible through the windows of the asylum. A group of local men, including Daniel Kershaw, rode to the facility to offer assistance in fighting what they assumed was a structure fire. They arrived to find the asylum's front doors standing open, an unusual circumstance as the building was normally kept locked. Inside the entrance hall, they discovered the body of Dr. Cornelius Greystone. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, a revolver still clutched in his right hand. Blood spatter, and the position of the body indicated he had been standing when he fired, and that death had been instantaneous. The fire was confined to Greystone's office on the second floor, where papers and books were still burning in the large fireplace. The flames had not spread beyond the office, suggesting they had been deliberately set for the purpose of destroying documents rather than resulting from an accidental blaze. The men moved through the building, searching for patients and staff who might require assistance or evacuation. The upper floors were empty, patient rooms standing vacant with beds neatly made. The situation in the basement level was far more disturbing. 14 patients were discovered huddled in the corridor outside the isolation ward, all in various states of psychological distress. Several had injuries consistent with attempts to escape the building, including bruised hands and bleeding fingers, as if they had been clawing at locked doors. None of the patients could provide a coherent account of what had happened. They spoke in fragments and refused to enter the isolation ward, screaming and fighting if anyone attempted to move them in that direction. 6 patients and 3 night staff members were missing entirely, with no indication of where they might have gone. Most disturbing was the condition of the isolation ward and the well chamber. The iron grate covering the well had been removed and lay on the floor nearby. The chamber walls were covered in what appeared to be dried blood and strange markings, the same geometric symbols that had been carved into the well stones, now painted or scratched onto every surface. The well itself gaped open, a black circle descending into unknown depths. Sheriff Henderson directed Deputy Mills to lower a lantern into the well to search for the missing individuals. According to Henderson's report, the light descended approximately 60 feet before the rope ran out, revealing nothing but darkness and the glimmer of water far below. The arrival of federal authorities at the Greystone Asylum represents one of the most unusual aspects of the entire case. On the 9th of March 1903, just 2 days after the incident, 4 United States Marshals arrived at the asylum, accompanied by 2 men identified in records only as government specialists. The speed of the federal response was extraordinary. Telegraph records from the Lebanon post office show that Sheriff Henderson had sent an urgent message to the governor's office on March 8, describing a situation requiring immediate state attention of the gravest nature. Rather than state officials or representatives from the asylum board, however, federal marshals arrived with orders signed by officials in Washington. Sheriff Henderson's personal papers, donated to the Laclede County Historical Society by his family in 1945, provide details about the marshals' actions that were not included in official reports. The 14 surviving patients were immediately removed from the asylum and placed in wagons under armed guard. When Henderson asked where they were being taken, he was told only that they would be transferred to a secure federal medical facility. The patients were never seen again. Local residents who had responded to the fire and who had entered the asylum that night were required to sign documents stating they would not discuss what they had witnessed under penalty of federal prosecution. Henderson himself was required to sign such an agreement. Most controversially, the federal specialists spent 3 full days in the asylum basement before beginning the sealing process. Henderson noted that they brought specialized equipment, including what appeared to be listening devices and acoustic measurement instruments. They also brought substantial quantities of cement, steel reinforcement, and heavy timbers. The sealing process proceeded in stages. First, the well chamber itself was filled with concrete to a depth of approximately 20 feet, completely covering the well opening and sealing whatever lay beneath. Then the entire isolation ward was walled off with brick and concrete, creating a permanent barrier. Finally, the basement-level access points were sealed, with steel doors welded shut and covered with additional masonry. A federal order dated the 15th of March 1903 officially declared the Greystone Asylum condemned and prohibited all entry under penalty of federal law. The order's language was unusually absolute, stating that the prohibition was permanent and non-negotiable, to remain in effect in perpetuity regardless of changes in ownership or jurisdiction. No explanation for this extraordinary measure was provided in the public order. The asylum property was declared federal territory, though no funds were allocated for maintenance or supervision. It simply stood, sealed and forbidden, a monument to something that official records refused to name. The documents that survived Dr. Greystone's attempt to destroy his research and the federal seizure of asylum records provide only fragmentary evidence of what transpired at the facility during its 36 years of operation. The Lebanon Gazette published a brief article on the 12th of March 1903, noting simply that the Greystone Asylum has been closed by federal order following the death of its superintendent. No mention was made of missing persons, unusual circumstances, or the extraordinary measures taken to seal the property. However, several key documents escaped destruction. Dr. Greystone's early correspondence with colleagues, preserved in medical school archives at institutions where he had studied and taught, reveals his long-standing interest in what he termed acoustic therapy. Letters, dating from the 1,860 seconds, describe his belief that sound and resonance could be used to treat mental illness, and his conviction that certain geological formations possessed unique properties beneficial to psychological health. One letter, from 1,870, mentions his excitement at discovering unusual acoustic characteristics in the limestone formations beneath the asylum property. A partially burned document recovered from Greystone's office and preserved in federal records provides more disturbing insights. The fragment, apparently from a longer research paper or journal article, describes a natural chamber far below the well's waterline, of considerable size and remarkable acoustic properties. Greystone writes of the chamber's ability to amplify and project sounds, creating effects he describes as transformative to human consciousness. He mentions discovering that the chamber seems to collect and preserve acoustic information, as if the limestone itself records and plays back sounds introduced into the space. Most disturbing is a single page found clutched in Dr. Greystone's hand after his death, apparently torn from a journal he kept during his final weeks. The handwriting is erratic, showing signs of extreme agitation. The text reads, "They are no longer patients, they are the congregation. The chamber has transformed them into something that exists between life and death, consciousness preserved in stone and water, singing together in harmony that should not be possible. The ones below want more. They call for more, but I cannot give them more. What I have done cannot be undone, but it must be ended. I will seal them below and then seal myself from this world. God forgive me for what I opened." Research by later investigators has attempted to understand Greystone's research through these fragments, but key questions remain unanswered. What did he discover in the natural chamber beneath the asylum? What happened to the patients who underwent deep-water therapy? And why did federal authorities respond so swiftly and absolutely to seal the facility? The fate of the 6 missing patients and 3 missing staff members from the night of the 7th of March 1903 has never been conclusively determined. Federal records, partially declassified in 1978 under pressure from journalists and historians, indicate that exhaustive search of the facility and surrounding area yielded no trace of the missing individuals. The well was reportedly explored by government specialists using what the records describe as advanced equipment, though the nature of this equipment is not specified. The specialists descended over 200 feet into the well, past the water level, and into what they confirmed was a natural chamber of extraordinary size in the limestone formation beneath the asylum. Their report, heavily redacted in its declassified form, states only that no human remains were located and that the chamber displayed unusual acoustic properties consistent with previous observations. Most disturbing is what happened to the 14 patients who survived and were removed by federal authorities. Researcher Clara Whitmore's 1967 investigation attempted to trace these individuals through census records, death certificates, medical facility admissions, and any other documentation that might reveal their fate. She found nothing. Not one of the 14 appeared in any subsequent records. They vanished from official existence as completely as if they had never been born. Federal records indicate only that the individuals were transferred to secure medical facilities for their own protection and the protection of others, but provide no location, no receiving institution, and no subsequent documentation. The few testimonies that survived provide disturbing hints about the survivor's mental state. A federal marshal's private journal, discovered after his death in 1942 and eventually donated to the National Archives, contains entries from March 1903 describing the removal of patients from the Greystone Asylum. The marshal writes that the survivors were largely uncommunicative, speaking only in whispers, and seeming reluctant to make any sound above the softest murmur. When they did speak, they repeated the same phrases. "They are still down there. The water isn't water." He opened the door but couldn't close it. One elderly woman grabbed the marshal's arm as they were loading patients into wagons and said, "You sealed the well, but you cannot seal what is already out. It's in the stone now. It's in the water that feeds the streams. It will spread through the limestone, chamber to chamber, until it finds others who will listen." Several patients exhibited extreme reactions to being removed from the asylum property, becoming agitated and claiming they could still hear the voices calling from the sealed well even as the wagons carried them away. The marshal noted that one young man kept turning to look back at the asylum until it disappeared from view, and then continued to look in that direction as if he could still see it, still hear it, across miles of intervening distance. For 50 years, following its federal sealing in 1903, the abandoned Greystone Asylum stood as a forbidden monument, gradually acquiring a reputation as a place of supernatural danger. The property remained technically under federal jurisdiction, though no active supervision or maintenance was provided. Nature began the slow process of reclaiming the structure, with vegetation growing unchecked and weather gradually eroding exposed surfaces. Yet the building's massive limestone construction ensured it remained fundamentally intact. Local folklore developed around the sealed asylum, with parents warning children to stay away from the property and travelers choosing alternate routes rather than passing near the abandoned structure. Despite the federal prohibition, occasional trespassers tested the sealed doors or attempted to enter through upper-floor windows. Those who succeeded in gaining entry reported disturbing experiences. In 1923, 3 teenage boys from Lebanon broke into the asylum on a dare. According to testimony one of them provided to his family years later, preserved in a letter his daughter wrote to the Lebanon Historical Society in 1956, they had explored the upper floors without incident until they stood above where the basement would be located. There, they heard sounds rising from below despite the concrete seals that supposedly made the basement inaccessible. The sounds were described as singing, multiple voices harmonizing in a language that hurt to hear, creating a physical sensation of pressure in the ears and chest. The boys fled in terror and refused to speak of the incident for years afterward. A geological survey team from the University of Missouri attempted to map cave systems in the region in 1937 as part of a broader study of Ozark karst formations. Their report, preserved in university archives, notes that acoustic anomalies were detected in the vicinity of the abandoned asylum structure, suggesting the presence of a large subterranean cavity beneath the facility. The team's preliminary findings indicated that this cavity was far larger than would be expected for a natural cave chamber in that geological context, and that it displayed unusual resonant properties. When the team requested permission to conduct a more detailed investigation, including access to the sealed asylum building, federal authorities denied the request without explanation. Multiple attempts by Laclede County officials to have the property released for demolition or redevelopment were similarly rejected. Correspondence preserved in county records shows that every request was met with the same response. The federal order sealing the facility remained in effect, the prohibition on entry was absolute, and no justification or timeline for potential release would be provided. In one 1948 letter, a federal official stated simply that the order was issued in the interest of public health and safety and that these concerns had not diminished with time. Renewed attention came to the sealed Greystone Asylum in 1965 when the Missouri Department of Transportation began planning for a new highway corridor that would pass within a mile of the property. Standard engineering surveys revealed something that previous investigations had missed or had chosen not to document. Seismic and ground-penetrating radar studies showed significant subsurface instability in the area directly beneath the asylum, indicating the presence of a massive cavity system that did not match any previously mapped cave formations. The survey data was turned over to geological consultants from the Missouri Geological Survey, who conducted a more detailed investigation using advanced equipment not available in earlier decades. Their report, preserved in State Transportation Department archives, provided the first scientific analysis of the natural chamber beneath the asylum. The cavity was estimated to extend over 1,200 square feet in area and rise approximately 40 feet from floor to ceiling, making it one of the largest natural chambers in the Ozark region. What made the discovery significant was not merely the chamber's size, but its acoustic properties. The geologist's report describes the chamber as an almost perfect acoustic resonator. Sound introduced into the chamber, whether through the well shaft or through natural cracks in the limestone, would be amplified dramatically and projected upward through the rock with unusual clarity. The report notes that this effect would be most pronounced with human voices, particularly voices singing or speaking in unison, which would be amplified and harmonized by the chamber's geometry in ways that would seem almost impossible to listeners above. The report's authors speculated that Dr. Greystone had somehow discovered this natural acoustic phenomenon and incorporated it into his treatment methods, perhaps believing that exposing patients to the amplified and resonant environment would have therapeutic effects. However, when the research team requested access to the sealed asylum to investigate the connection between the well and the chamber and to study how Greystone had utilized the acoustic properties, federal authorities again denied permission. The denial came in the form of a letter from the Department of the Interior, stating that the federal order sealing the Greystone facility remains in effect. The nature of the public health hazard present at this location is classified and cannot be disclosed. Under no circumstances should the seals be breached or the site disturbed. The highway was rerouted to pass farther from the asylum property than originally planned, adding nearly 2 miles to the road's length and significantly increasing construction costs, rather than risk any impact on the sealed facility. More than a century after its sealing, the Greystone Asylum remains standing, a testament to the durability of limestone construction and a federal determination that whatever lies within must never be disturbed. The building, now over 150 years old, shows significant deterioration from weather and neglect, yet the concrete seals installed in 1903 remain intact. The federal order prohibiting entry has never been rescinded or modified. Modern documentation of the site comes primarily from people who claim to have experienced unusual phenomena in the vicinity of the property. Hikers and hunters who venture near the asylum, despite warnings and no trespassing signs, report hearing sounds that seem to rise from the ground, described consistently as voices singing in harmony, many voices, too many voices, in a language that feels wrong to hear. In 2003, exactly 100 years after the facility's sealing, a group of paranormal investigators equipped with audio recording equipment attempted to document these reported phenomena. Before they could be removed from the property by federal authorities, who maintain occasional patrols despite the site's remote location, they captured recordings of what they described as a chorus of voices rising from beneath the asylum. Analysis of their recordings, copies of which were preserved before the original equipment was confiscated, shows what appears to be dozens of distinct human voices speaking or singing in unison, counting repeatedly from 1 to 13 in a language that linguistic experts have been unable to identify. Legal efforts to have the property declassified and made available for demolition or historical preservation have continued sporadically, all meeting with federal refusal. The most recent denial in 2019 included an unusually explicit statement. The risk posed by the Greystone facility has not diminished with time. Current monitoring indicates that the conditions that necessitated the original sealing order remain present. The seals must be maintained indefinitely. The well must never be reopened. Anonymous testimony from a federal contractor provided to a journalist in 2015 claimed that acoustic monitoring equipment has been installed in the sealed basement and that this equipment has detected ongoing sound patterns emanating from the location of the original well. The source stated that organized acoustic activity continues in the chamber far below, activity that has persisted without cessation for over a century since the asylum was sealed. As if something down there continues to sing, waiting for the day when the seals fail or are deliberately broken, and the voices sealed in stone and water can finally be heard by the world above.